Fog creeps over the remnants of a forgotten field, thick like smoke from a fire that was never extinguished. Trees bend as if ashamed, and beneath them, in soil untouched by sunlight, lies a past so horrifying that even time itself seems to recoil from it. It is here, on this quiet patch of land in upstate New York, that history did something unthinkable. It buried the truth, beneath dirt, beneath doctrine, beneath silence. It happened in 1857, the kind of year that lives only in crumbling ledgers and forgotten court records. A brutal winter had frozen the creeks of Cold Spring Hollow, a secluded town tucked between barren hills. On the morning of January 19th, townsfolk gathered by the edge of the woods near the town square. They stood in stiff silence, not for prayer or sermon, but for a hanging. 3 children, boys, their faces gaunt and clothes too small, were marched barefoot across the snow-packed ground toward a wooden platform hastily built from barn scraps. They were 9, 11, and 12 years old. Their names have been lost or erased. What remains is a single note in the town's final court docket. 3 orphan boys, guilty of theft, profanity, and moral disobedience. Punishment by rope. It reads more like inventory than judgment. There was no priest offering salvation, no mother weeping, no one asking why. Just 3 small figures lifted above the crowd, and then silence. Final, absolute silence. If it sounds impossible, it's because we've been trained to think it is. This is America, after all. A land of justice, not child executions. And yet, the deeper we look, the more the pieces begin to surface. This wasn't a one-time act of madness. It wasn't just the mistake of a brutal sheriff or a frenzied mob. No, this was sanctioned, deliberate, approved by the town's council. All of them God-fearing men who believed they were doing holy work. But why? And how? The name Cold Spring Hollow doesn't appear on most modern maps. Officially, it was abandoned in 1863, a ghost town like so many others swallowed by the slow decay of time. But even back then, it was never a place of progress. It was isolationist by design. Founded by a splinter group of strict Calvinist reformers who believed the world was slipping into ruin, it functioned like a religious colony. Outsiders were unwelcome. Their laws were derived less from civil code and more from Old Testament fire. And no group suffered more under this theocratic rule than the children, particularly the orphans. The orphanage, if one can call it that, stood on the edge of town. A stone building with iron bars on the windows and a wooden cross nailed to the roof. To the townspeople, these children weren't innocent. They were born of sin, the offspring of drunkards, harlots, and criminals. They carried the stains of their bloodlines like curses. The doctrine taught in Cold Spring Hollow claimed that suffering purged the soul, and for the unwanted, that suffering came daily. We only know about the hangings because of one letter. A single surviving document, written by a traveling peddler named Elias Marr, who passed through Cold Spring Hollow just days after the executions. In a letter to his sister he wrote, "There is something wrong here. The people speak in whispers. The children are missing, or sickly. A man at the inn told me they hung 3 lads for stealing bread. I thought he joked, but his eyes said, 'Otherwise, I will not stay the night.'" Marr's letter is stored in a local historical society in Albany, rarely viewed, often dismissed. But it is one of the only external accounts confirming what the town itself tried to hide. So why has no one heard this story? Why is there no mention in school books, no documentaries, no plaques in memory of those lost boys? The truth is, Cold Spring Hollow didn't just vanish, it was erased. Burned records, abandoned property, generations that refused to speak. Over time, nature crept back in, covering what man had done. And those who knew or suspected learned to look the other way. After all, who wants to believe that a God-fearing town could hang its own children? But the signs are still there. If you know where to look, A cracked headstone with no name, dated 1857. A rusted iron hook protruding from an old tree stump in the woods. And in one sealed archive in a dusty courthouse basement, an unsigned letter of resignation from the town's only schoolteacher, dated 1 week after the executions. It ends with a single chilling sentence: "They were only boys." And yet, to this day, no official apology, no investigation. Just the wind through hollow trees and the echo of a question that no one wants to answer. What did those children really do to deserve the rope? And perhaps more frightening, what did the people of Cold Spring Hollow believe they were saving themselves from? Because if the children weren't the monsters, then who was? Asterisk before Cold Spring Hollow earned its reputation as the town that hanged its children, it was something else entirely. A dream, a haven, a clean slate carved from the unforgiving wilderness of upstate New York. Its founders weren't criminals or outlaws. They were zealots, disciplined, determined, and unwavering in their belief that the world beyond their hills was drowning in sin. The town was founded in 1823 by a man named Abner Wills, a stern, gaunt-faced preacher descended from a long line of Puritan ministers. Wills had once served in Boston, but his sermons grew increasingly harsh, increasingly obsessed with purity, with punishment, and with a coming reckoning. He was eventually forced out after claiming from the pulpit that children born of impure hearts would birth the devil's kingdom on earth. That same winter, he left the city behind and took 50 families with him, followers who shared his apocalyptic vision. They headed north, away from the coast, away from progress, and deep into the forest where land was cheap and neighbors were few. There among thickets and fog, they established Cold Spring Hollow. The town's name came from a mineral spring nearby, said to be so cold year-round that it never unfroze, even in summer. To the settlers, it was a sign that this place would never yield to the corrupting warmth of the outside world. That here they could build something holy. And so they did. But holiness in Cold Spring Hollow meant hardship. From the start, the town was organized not just by need, but by theology. The church was the center of everything, both spiritually and legally. There was no town council, no sheriff, only the elders, all men appointed by Wills, whose interpretations of Scripture became law. Children were baptized not at birth, but only after completing 3 years of obedience training. Education focused less on reading or numbers and more on memorizing punishments from Leviticus. Whispers from neighboring villages spoke of children lashed for lying, and young girls denied bread for speaking out of turn. But those villages were far enough away, and Cold Spring Hollow was insular enough that no one dared interfere. In 1839, the orphanage was built. Its foundation, quite literally, rested on the belief that sin could be inherited. To Pastor Wills, orphans were the most dangerous element in society. They came without lineage, without oversight. They were the result of failed families, families who had died in vice, or turned away from God. In Will's eyes, these children were broken from the start, and only the harshest correction could save them. Asterisk, he called the orphanage the house of Lamentation. It was not a home. Stone walls without insulation. No fireplace, only a coal stove in the main hallway. Beds made of straw, and uniforms of coarse wool, regardless of season. They were awakened at dawn by bell, fed gruel, and required to fast twice a week. Each morning began with what Wills called the examination, a ritual of public confession, where children were expected to admit their wrongdoings before breakfast. Refusal to speak was considered a sin of pride. Lying was met with physical punishment, but some testimonies suggest it wasn't just punishment that awaited them. Asterisk, in a crumbling journal discovered decades later in an attic in nearby Monroe, a former resident of Cold Spring Hollow, a woman named Mercy Dent, wrote of her time at the House of Lamentation as a child. She survived and escaped, but never spoke of it until her old age. In her journal, she describes shadowy night lessons conducted by hooded elders, where children were made to chant verses backwards or remain awake for 3 nights straight in total silence. She speaks of a cellar locked by chain, from which strange humming sometimes rose. And she writes of one terrifying ritual in particular, the drawing. Every year, on the second Sunday of December, the orphans were lined up and made to draw lots. Mercy writes, "If you drew the black thread, you were taken. No one knew where. They said you were being purified. The rest of us, we were made to scrub your bed clean and never speak your name again." There are no official records of these rituals. Of course there aren't, but what makes Mercy's account chilling is not just the detail, it's the dates. In 1856, the winter before the known executions took place, she writes that 3 black threads were drawn. The same number of boys hanged in 1857, and she describes them. One had a limp, one never spoke, and one used to sing when he thought no one listened. What kind of community looks at a child singing to himself and sees a vessel of sin? Cold Spring Hollow wasn't a town governed by logic. It was governed by fear. Fear of contamination, of deviation, of moral collapse. Its people believed they were waging a spiritual war against the world, and that every child, especially the unclaimed, was a potential enemy. In the end, they didn't see children. They saw curses in small bodies, and curses, they believed, had to be cast out. Even if it meant a noose. The first known disappearance occurred in the autumn of 1843. A boy named Samuel, no last name recorded, vanished from the House of Lamentation just days before his 12th birthday. There was no alarm, no formal inquiry. A single line was added to the orphanage ledger in cramped, neat script, claimed by the Hand of Correction. The entry was initialed by one of the church elders, and nothing more was said. Over the next decade, more children vanished, always in winter, always without explanation. 11 in total, though the exact number is debated. Some were recorded as having fled into the woods, others as spiritually compromised. There were no burials, no investigations, no evidence of escape. The town's silence was consistent, absolute. It's as if the children were swallowed whole by the land. But it wasn't until the winter of 1856 that the pattern cracked, not because someone intervened, but because the town decided, for reasons unknown, to stop hiding what they were doing. Instead, they made it public. On January 2, 1857, the Cold Spring Hollow elders convened a gathering in the church square. Town records list this meeting as the Purification Assembly. From surviving fragments of a court record preserved in a private family archive, we know what followed. 3 boys, their names recorded only once, Isaac, Elias, and Matthew, were accused of theft, insubordination, and invocation of profane speech. The items allegedly stolen? A candlestick, dried bread, and a page torn from a hymnal. The profane speech was never specified. They were orphans, aged 9, 11, and 12. No lawyers, no families, no defense. According to the account, their trial lasted just under 2 hours. They were sentenced to death by hanging, the execution to be carried out in 12 days' time. The town's record keeper, believed to be Elder Thomas Reed, wrote in the trial log, "The cleansing of these souls will serve as a final example to the house. Judgment, when swift and public, deters rebellion and pleases the Lord." 12 days later, just as the sun broke over the frozen ridge, the gallows were raised near the orphanage. The town gathered in silence, including the other children. Witnesses stood on packed snow, their breaths rising like ghosts. No one spoke, no hymns were sung. And then, the rope. What happened afterward remains murky. The gallows were dismantled before nightfall. The children's bodies were not buried in the town cemetery. Some accounts say they were burned. Others that they were buried deep in the woods near the cold spring itself. the spot said to hold spiritual power. What is certain is that after that day, nothing in Cold Spring Hollow was ever the same. Within weeks, strange things began to happen. The town schoolteacher, a woman named Martha Bell, resigned unexpectedly, leaving behind a single note. "I have seen enough. These children are not the danger." In February, a fire consumed the back half of the church. It was declared an accident, but no repairs were ever made. Then, that spring, a group of traveling traders arrived to find the town half abandoned. Several homes stood empty, doors left open, meals half prepared. The traders described the place as unnaturally still. They stayed one night and never returned. Over the next 6 years, Cold Spring Hollow emptied out. Some say the residents moved east, blending into other communities and never speaking of what had happened. Others say they simply disappeared, much like the children before them. By 1863, Cold Spring Hollow was formally declared uninhabited. The state sent an official to catalog the land and assess it for repurposing. His report, preserved in state archives, was only 1 page long. It ends with the line, "There's no one here." No livestock, no firewood, no signs of recent activity. Only a heavy silence and the smell of damp stone. Years later, a local boy from a nearby town wandered into the abandoned area. He told his parents he found an old building, and beneath it, a locked iron grate. When asked what was inside, he simply said, "Singing." No such structure was ever found when searchers went back. There's also the matter of the final journal. Entry from Mercy Dent, the orphan girl who escaped the House of Lamentation and lived to adulthood. In her last recorded entry, dated July 12, 1891, she writes, "I dreamed of the boys again, not as they were, but taller now. Still barefoot, standing in the field where nothing grows. They were not angry, just waiting. The gallows are gone. Now, the orphanage rotted away decades ago, its stone foundation swallowed by roots. But visitors, those who find their way to the former town site, report an eerie feeling as if being watched. Some claim to hear children crying, others whisper of cold spots, even in summer. Most who come don't stay long, and no matter how deep the snow falls each winter, the center of the field, the place where the gallows once stood, never holds it. The ground stays bare, as if still warm, or recently disturbed. The story of Cold Spring Hollow isn't just about one horrifying act. It's about what happens when fear replaces reason, when theology eclipses humanity, and when silence becomes a shield for atrocity. 3 children hanged in broad daylight, and not a soul in town spoke a word against it. Asterisk when news of the 1857 executions finally reached the broader public. It didn't come in the form of a headline or a scandal. It came as a whisper buried in a regional trade circular, mentioned briefly by a merchant who had passed through Cold Spring Hollow and found the town unusually solemn, mourning the recent judgment upon 3 wayward boys. The line, almost casual in its wording, sparked no outrage, no editorials, no outcry. Just a passing discomfort quickly forgotten. Part of the reason the event vanished so quickly from public consciousness lies in timing. America was lurching towards civil war. Political tensions, economic instability, and the growing horror of slavery consumed the nation's attention. What was one bizarre story from an obscure backwater town compared to the looming national crisis? Cold Spring Hollow was too small, too remote, and too zealously secretive to warrant deeper investigation. But among those who did hear, those few who read between the lines, questions lingered. The first outsider to investigate was a young seminary student from Syracuse named John Langley, who had stumbled upon the peddler Elias Marr's letter while cataloging correspondence in a church archive. Struck by the blunt reference to children being executed and the strange, dreamlike tone of the letter, Langley set out to find the town in the summer of 1866. What he found or failed to find deepened the mystery. Langley described Cold Spring Hollow as a hollow in name and nature. The town itself absent, its layout betrayed only by stone outlines in the grass. He found the ruins of what appeared to be a church, collapsed inward with blackened beams. Nearby, he reported seeing the remains of a cellar door, sealed shut with rusted chains. Langley tried to lift it but claimed a wave of nausea forced him to stop. His journal, which now rests in a locked drawer at a private university archive, ends with a cryptic entry. "I don't think it was just fear. I think they believed they had to do it. That if they didn't hang the children, something worse would come." This entry has become the root of one of the more persistent theories, that the townspeople were not simply acting out religious hysteria, but responding to something they believed was real. Something inside those children, or perhaps something they believed had entered them. Historians tend to explain the events of Cold Spring Hollow as a result of extreme isolation, theological extremism, and unchecked authority. The children in this reading were victims of a closed society pushed beyond reason by hunger, fear, and misguided faith. In this view, the executions were less about justice and more about maintaining the illusion of control in a town slowly succumbing to madness. But there are other theories, darker ones that refuse to let go. One theory posits that the town, built on land rumored to be sacred or cursed by local indigenous tribes, believed the children had become vessels for something ancient. Whispered legends in the area speak of Skiles as knights and children who spoke truths they never learned. Of course, these are dismissed by mainstream historians as folklore, reinterpreted through the lens of 19th century spiritual paranoia. But even skeptics admit the consistency of these oral accounts is unsettling. Another theory is psychological, suggesting mass psychogenic illness, a kind of spiritual hysteria that spread through the community. With no access to outside views or critical thought, the people of Cold Spring Hollow may have collectively convinced themselves that certain children were possessed, cursed, or impure. In such an atmosphere, even the most horrific acts could be justified as moral necessities. Perhaps most disturbing is the theory put forward by Dr. Linnea Voss, a religious sociologist who studied the writings of Pastor Abner Wills extensively. In her unpublished thesis, she claimed the town may have engaged in ritual executions as a form of atonement, not just for the sins of the children, but for the sins of the town itself. She noted how Will's sermons often referenced the blood of the blameless cleansing the rot of the many. She points to the 1857 event as a carefully staged rite, public, symbolic, and spiritually motivated. In her words, they didn't just believe the children were guilty. They believed the children had to be guilty because they needed them to be. The implications are chilling. If true, this was not simply a failure of justice or morality. It was a deliberate sacrifice. A blood ritual dressed up in legal language, carried out under the guise of divine law. Despite all these theories, Cold Spring Hollow has remained mostly untouched. The land is now privately owned by a shadowy holding company that has refused all requests for excavation, citing environmental concerns. Multiple attempts by historians and documentarians to secure interviews with descendants of the town's residents have been met with silence or, in rare cases, threats of legal action. Some speculate a concerted effort to erase the town's legacy. Others believe the silence is born of shame. And still, the questions persist. Why were the children really hanged? Why did the entire town abandon its homes and disappear within 6 years? And what was it, real or imagined, that they believed had infected the orphans of Cold Spring Hollow? No official body has ever reinvestigated the case. No historical commission has mounted an inquiry. The state of New York lists Cold Spring Hollow as a historical anomaly with incomplete records. That phrase, to some, says everything. Incomplete records, an incomplete truth, and a complete silence. Asterisk today. There's nothing left of Cold Spring Hollow but silence. The trees have reclaimed the roads. The stone foundations are choked with moss, and the sky above the old clearing seems permanently overcast even in summer. Locals call it the Quiet Land. Hikers avoid it. Surveyors mark their maps around it. No new homes have ever been built on the site. No one lives there. No one ever has, not since the last residents vanished over 160 years ago. And yet, the story refuses to die. Each generation rediscovers it in fragments. A crumbling letter in a family Bible, a curious journal in a locked attic, an offhand mention in an archived newspaper clipping. There's no complete narrative, no single document that confirms all the pieces. But when you start to stitch the scraps together, when you read Elias Marr's warning, mercy-dense memories, the town's trial records, the resignation notes, the priest's burned sermons, you begin to see the shape of something truly horrifying. And still, so many questions remain unanswered. Why did a small, isolated town go from secret disappearances to public executions? What drove them to murder 3 children in daylight with witnesses and still believe they were righteous? Why did no one stop them? And perhaps most disturbingly, why does no one speak of it now? Historians often talk about gaps in the record. But with Cold Spring Hollow, it's more like a wound. A deliberate erasure. Property deeds vanish in the 1860s. Baptismal registries are torn from church archives. Pages are ripped from legal logs with clean, practiced precision. Even the few maps that once marked Cold Spring Hollow by name have been revised over the decades. Its land, now labeled only as private reserve or restricted wildlife area. But no wildlife researchers have ever published findings from that land. No government departments list any protected species in that zone. It's as if the town never existed at all. But it did. You can still walk the path into the hollow. Locals won't guide you, but some maps show the trails. If you go, you'll find what others have found. A strange stillness, the sensation of being watched, and the subtle discomfort of walking on land that seems to resist every step. Some claim to hear faint crying. Others speak of a ringing sound in the air, like a distant church bell. And if you make it to the center of the old clearing, you'll see what looks like an old scaffold base, rotted timbers poking from the earth like ribs, and a large circle of ground where nothing grows. Even in spring, it's bare, bone-dry, as though scorched from below. Some say the children never left. There are urban legends, of course. One speaks of a group of teenagers who camped there in the 1970s. They were never found. Another tells of a local reporter in the 90s who was researching a book on forgotten towns. He visited the site and returned home incoherent, muttering about black threads and the rope still swinging. He was institutionalized for the remainder of his life. His notes have never been recovered. There are those who believe Cold Spring Hollow was a cult, one of many, perhaps, but its story is uniquely disturbing for one reason: it was allowed. It wasn't hidden until after the fact. The town executed children in front of witnesses, and the world simply moved on. No justice, no reckoning, no names carved in stone. Just a sharp, sudden silence that has lasted over a century and a half. And that silence is louder than any scream. The more you dig, the more it feels like something is watching the watchers. That there's a reason the story never made it into textbooks, that every attempt to expose it ends in locked archives, missing files, or broken trails. Maybe it's fear. Maybe it's shame. Or maybe, just maybe, it's something worse. What if the people of Cold Spring Hollow were wrong? But what if they weren't? What if they believed they were containing something, and in doing so, committed an unthinkable act, not out of malice, but desperation? What if the ritual, the hangings, the silence, was all part of something older? And if that's true, then what happens now that we remember? Stories like this one aren't just unsettling because of what they say about the past. They're unsettling because of what they say about us. Our willingness to forget. Our fear of digging too deep. Our need to look away when the truth is too cruel, too strange, or too close to home. Cold Spring Hollow wasn't just erased, that it was buried. And still, the ground is restless. There are no names for the boys who died that day in 1857. No graves to mark their suffering. No photographs to honor their stolen childhoods. But perhaps remembering them, truly remembering, is the first act of justice they've ever received. And maybe, if you ever find yourself walking that hollow ground, and you feel the air go still, don't speak. Don't run, just listen. Because sometimes in the quiet, you can still hear the rope creak.